I gave my cell phone to someone because it needed to be charged, and I know for a fact that it has not been silenced. Okay, so if it's not going to bother us, it can stay on. So thanks for coming out. A group of us went out to dinner beforehand, and we drove in, and the parking lot was packed. And we're like, oh my God, this is going to be, we just found out that it's for a funeral next door. So I'm still really happy that all of you are here, and sometimes a slightly smaller group can make for a more intimate conversation. So what I'm going to do is talk for about 30 minutes. I'm going to tell you my story and some of the thoughts and experience I've been having since I've written this book, and then we'll have some Q&A, and then we'll get to the great book sale that you all have organized. So, can I see, show of hands, how many people here have actually read my book? It's not a homework assignment, it just helps me gauge what to talk about. Whoa, okay, that's a high percentage. Okay, so you're going to be a little bored, because I am going to repeat my story. What I want to do before we start is I want to have everybody turn to someone near you, and we're going to take just 2 minutes to talk to one another about what you think makes talking about race so hard. And then we're going to start from there. So find someone, and I will keep track of the time. You thought you were coming to hear me talk.
You can talk later. Actually, I can talk
Okay, so I'm going to interrupt you. Right? You just get started and I cut you off, but I'd love to hear what some of you came up with. What makes talking about race so hard? You all were talking about it.
Martha made gracefully.
Martha's been put on the spot by her friend. What? Are you willing to share?
Sure. No. Like religion, like politics, I throw race in the same pool, that if you're not sure where someone's coming from and what their sort of incoming perspective is, it's very hard to sort of start the conversation.
Yeah. Did everyone hear that? If you're not sure what someone's incoming beliefs are, understanding is, it's very hard to start the conversation? Yeah. Because why? What could happen?
Could be confrontational.
Could be confrontational.
I confess to having only as yet read part of your book. And I was struck right away in the beginning by your saying, I grew up not understanding that I was a race. And so there's such a journey to go on before you can get to the meat of the conversation.
Right, it's hard, especially cross-racially. That's hard because if a person of color goes to offer their make themselves vulnerable, tell their story about their experience of living in a racialized world, and the white person is like, tell me more of your story. I was going to say, yeah. So there's it's an imbalance. Others?
Fear of making a microaggression.
Fear of making a microaggression, otherwise known as a slight, without even knowing it usually. If you're the white person without knowing it, yeah. Did anyone come up with fear of, oh, go ahead.
I was just going to say fear of using a wrong term or offending somebody or saying a wrong term.
Fear of using a wrong term, offending somebody. Anybody come up with?
Maybe even being too sensitive, like falsely sensitive, instead of just real.
There's something about it that, well, actually, no. I'm not going to make an assumption. Can you say more about that?
I'll give you an example. And this may seem wrong to someone, I shouldn't say this, but I said it today, I'll be honest. I was hanging out with some friends and someone decided to get coffee. And they said, how do you want your coffee? And I says, well, I'd like to have my coffee black, just the way you like your men, Renee. And that might seem wrong, but she only dates black men, so it was kind of true. And maybe it might not be good, but that could be offensive to some people, but it was kind of true. And then I've been much more offensive when I try to sort of step gently around something and someone can see that I'm terribly uncomfortable.
Okay, so you've hit on a really important point,
Yeah.
which is you're damned if you do and you're damned if you don't. And this is true of all systems of oppression. And so if you're damned if you do, you're damned if you don't, the easiest thing is to do nothing, right? Okay. If you had told me America was a system of oppression, I would have told you you were crazy. It's the best country in the world. It's a level playing field. All men are created equal. One nation indivisible by all. And those are fantastic ideals. And they are we're still trying to meet them. And I want to talk to you about the process I went through from really, to my core, believing that America was a level playing field, to understanding that there was a system of oppression in which I was both benefiting and participating. So I grew up in Winchester, Mass., which probably a lot of you know, which was and I was born in 1960s, to place us in time. In 1960, so I grew up in the 60s and 70s. And you know, I'm from one of these New England families where sort of second, third, and fourth cousins marry second, third, and fourth cousins, and we're all sort of related, and we marry fathers, college, roommate kind of things. And so not only was I from Winchester, an isolated white bubble, but I was from a family that was big and hung out together all the time. And that meant that my worldview was about this big. And they were achieving very well. So I thought my worldview was expansive because we had figured everything out. We really knew how to make life work for us. And, you know, the rugged individual, we had some stories of people coming over and pulling themselves up by their bootstraps. We had some stories about Mayflower ancestors. There was just all these ways, all these myths that I had bought into that my family got where it did purely on hard work. And I met lots of people in my childhood, well, a few, who were of Italian or Irish descent, who would say, you know, my grandparents or great-grandparents came over with 2 pennies in their pocket, and in a couple generations, their grandchildren and great-grandchildren were getting PhDs, were leading corporations, were in government. And so it all made a lot of sense to me as I existed in my white bubble. And then after my years in Winchester, during which for high school I went to the Windsor School. I have some fellow alum here. And then I went to Kenyon. I have some fellow alum here too. Kenyon, again, a white bubble. I come back to Boston. And I loved the arts, but I was really bad at performing, and so I got into the administrative end of it. And one of my first jobs was being the general manager at First Night. And the mission there was to bring together the many diverse neighborhoods of Boston using the arts. So I ended up marching around neighborhoods for the first time in my life, stepping foot into neighborhoods I didn't know existed, and I was getting a lot of encouragement to do so by the fundraising community. People were very excited to give me money to make First Night programs happen. So I ended up walking in and out of neighborhoods, and it became really obvious to me, really fast, that when I would step into one neighborhood that was dilapidated, it would be full of black and brown people. And I'd step into another neighborhood that was shiny and manicured, and it would be full of white people. And I felt welcome and happy in the white communities, and I got the sense I wasn't that welcome in the black and brown communities. And the only way I had to make sense, particularly of the material difference I was looking at, was to fall back on something I didn't know I'd digested, and that was the idea that white people were superior. And if white people are superior, it would hold that black and brown people are inferior. And somewhere in my childhood, I had digested that. So it made sense to me, and the playing field was level. I had been taught that, and this was proof positive, because all you had to do was work hard in America, and you could make it. So I went into overdrive because I'd grown up in Winchester, and I had this extended family. I had a lot of what's called social capital. I had a lot of the language and the customs and the connections to go and raise money. And people were very comfortable giving money to me because they made the assumption I knew what I was doing with money. And they were more than happy to have me go help and fix these poor people in these neighborhoods that couldn't seem to help and fix themselves. And I call this in my book my Robin Hood syndrome. So I wasn't coming from a hateful place towards people of a different race, but I was coming from a very patronizing place in which I was assuming that somehow I was superior and I would have answers. So Cut to a little later in my life, I became a classroom teacher. Once I had my own family, I switched careers. I became a classroom teacher in Cambridge, Massachusetts, where Cambridge is a diverse city in aggregate, and yet we have huge segregation neighborhood by neighborhood, just like Boston. So to overcome that, instead of having neighborhood schools, the schools have a lottery system, and the goal is that every school will represent the broader demographics of the city, and even every classroom. So when they go to place classrooms, they're looking at how many of this socioeconomic bracket, how many of this racial group. So here I am, now I'm in charge not of a city and building bridges across diverse neighborhoods, but I've got and I was a K-1-2 teacher. So I've got little people and I still can't do it. I feel less appreciated and able to connect with the black and brown children, and seamless connections with the white children and the white families. And I knew that there was something wrong, and I knew there was an elephant in the room, I just didn't know it was me. Not yet, but I was about to find out. So at the age of 48, which was 7 years ago, I ended up going back to get my graduate degree in special ed. And the first course at Wheelout College was a required course called Racial and Cultural Identities. My first thought was, well, I don't need that. I've been kind of doing, oh, by the way, I've been on diversity committees for much of this 25 years, where I don't think anyone ever used the language that I'm going to be using with you tonight. And my first thought was, I don't really need that course. I've been diversity committees, and maybe I should just skip over that one. No, not allowed, have to take it. And then I thought, well, this is going to be good, because I'm going to go learn about those people I've been trying to reach and haven't been able to. So I was surprised the first day of class when the professor said, this is going to be one of the hardest things you've ever done. Lots of papers, lots of reading. The hardest part, though, is going to be that you're going to do a 6-month deep dive into your own racial identity. And this is when I said, what am I going to do? Because I really, at that point, did not know I had a racial identity. So cut to 6 months later, and what I learned had shaken me up and unraveled my world enough that I left my job. I left my program. I decided not to continue. I thought all I can do is keep studying this and putting myself back together, because I just had my belief system completely knocked out from under me. And I think I'll write about it as I go, because I knew from over those 6 months as I talked to friends and family that I was not alone in the level of ignorance that I had been carrying around with me. So now everyone says, well, what happened? What did you learn? Well, it was 6 months, so it was a lot. So I'll share with you just this one night where I went to class. And this was about a third of the way through it, and we watched, has anyone here seen Race, the Power of an Illusion? Personally, I think that every American should get a $1,000 tax credit for watching all 3 parts. I think it should be an online course. I know we can do it. We do it for head injury with sports departments. We should be doing it with racism. But part 3 focuses on America's housing and lending systems in the 1900s. So I sit down, and they start talking about the GI Bill. And I think, I know the GI Bill. Whew, finally it's something I know about, because this had all been so new to me. Well, my father had been in World War II, as were a lot of the men in my family, the men in my neighborhoods, a lot of my friends' fathers. And though they really never talked about the war, they all talked about the GI Bill. And what the GI Bill had done is when all these men had come home in their early 20s, it had offered low-cost, very low interest rate mortgages and free higher ed. So I knew that just in my family, my father had gone to Harvard Law School for free on the GI Bill, and that my parents had bought their first home in Winchester for $17,000. They were so proud of that fact. And in part that the cost was low because of the GI Bill, and then the monthly mortgage they paid was unbelievably low. So I'm watching this, and it's talking about the way mortgages were structured and the GI Bill, and it's showing all these happy guys, and it says the 1 million black GIs who served in World War II were not able to access the GI Bill. And I had to say, wait a second, I'm not sure I knew there were black GIs in World War II. Was that? I later went on to investigate just that piece to realize that when I look in textbooks, history books, When I look at films about World War II, they're always white faces. So whitewashed would be the word for that. But the way it worked was it didn't say anywhere in the GI Bill, and this is how sneaky systemic racism is, and it still plays out today. It didn't say anywhere in the GI Bill that black GIs need not apply, but it worked like this. A black GI wants to go get a house, still has to go to a bank to get the loan, as did my father. But banks have been advised and operate under guidelines put forth by the FHA, the Federal Housing Authority. And in the FHA language, written in black and white, it said, if a neighborhood has even one non-white family move in, it becomes too risky to make a loan. And so, if you look at Boston, or you look at any major city, and actually many, I learned that Needham had its own, what's called a redlining map. Cities would be lined, usually with 4 gradations. If it was a neighborhood lined in red, was way too risky, and you can guess who was living there. That was predominantly black and brown people. A town like Winchester would be lined in green. No problem, great investment. And then there would be blue and orange, or some different colors. And the closer we got to Winchester, green, the lower the risk, and the closer we got to red, the higher the risk. So a black GI could not get a loan through the FHA and through the GI Bill, because the minute you step into that neighborhood, it changes. And in fact, realtors would never bring you there. So in going around and talking and studying this issue, I have 2% of black GIs were able to access the housing portion of the GI Bill, and I have learned in the 2 people who I've actually met who were black GIs who were able to, in both cases, they worked for a university, and the university underwrote it. So that's what happened on the housing front. That was the barrier. And then on the education front, there was a quota system in the 40s. So when GIs came home, those positions those spots filled right up. But there was something bigger and more sinister going on, and that is that people like my dad came home from the war, and he didn't have to support his parents, and he didn't have to support my mother's parents, because they were doing just fine thanks to the Social Security program, which was a prior racialized program. How was it racialized? It excluded domestic and agricultural workers who were disproportionately black and brown. So you can start to see, and now both of those programs were just in the 1900s, so we're just now talking in a span of 50 years, 2 programs out of hundreds through 400 years. 2 programs that systematically advantaged white people in a material way. So the night I heard this, I started shaking. Uncontrollable shaking. Had a full-blown asthma attack. Got out of class, and I called my husband, and I said, I can't come home. I cannot have our children see me this way. I'm just no good. I've got to go drive around and pull myself together. So I went from Wheelock, and I drove through Arlington and Lexington, and then I went to Winchester, and I parked in front of my childhood home, which had been this, like, the Norman Rockwell, warmest, coziest, that was like my happy place. I loved my home. My parents were no longer alive, so obviously no longer living there. The house isn't in my family anymore. But I sat there, and I could not get the house back. I couldn't look at it without seeing just this toxic injustice. And I felt like I had been played. I felt like a pawn in a game that if you had explained the rules to me going into life, or at the age of 5 or 10 or 12, I wouldn't have signed up for it. And so I was really shaken. I came home, said to my husband, what do you know about the GI Bill? And like me, he knew nothing about it being racialized. He thought it was available to everyone. He did know there were black GIs. So that was a moment where I thought, no, wait a second. So Winchester wasn't just white by accident. It was white, it was made white by barricading black and brown people. And okay, they said $120 billion went from US government coffers into the hands of white GIs. and 2% of that went to black GIs. Well, doesn't that kind of make me like, isn't that public assistance? Like, I had been a Republican to that point. And then I thought, so wait a second, and property tax, schools are based on property tax, so that means that the schooling that I got, okay, the FHA is saying that these are more valuable. That means that whiteness is basically a value, it's a property, and that value got put into my school system. Hold on, living in Winchester doesn't just mean I like crossed some racial line. It means I had superior housing, I got all the social capital, that I was able to get a job, I had better transportation, I had better food, I had better medical care. Like, oh my God, where does this end? So that was one of those moments where I felt like, I don't know if there's an end to studying this, but I can't not study it. I felt as if I had discovered a family secret. And I couldn't stop thinking about it. Not everybody who wakes up white has this reaction, but I just want to give you a sense of how deeply it hit me. So I guess one question I started to ask in the months afterwards was, why didn't I know about this? Because I started to think about times where I think, in retrospect, and I now know, that people were trying to tell me. I did have a handful of friends and colleagues of color. And people had been trying to tell me. And what I have learned is that a person of color will make a small step towards seeing what you might know. This is when you were talking about if you don't know what someone's beliefs are. I now see that people were trying to understand what I did and didn't believe. And as soon as they understood that I was still in this sort of 180-degree, white people are saviors, white people are superior, perspective, they weren't going to go there with me. And so I started to really think about the degree to which I had internalized this idea of natural order, and where did that come from? And I started looking through family photo albums and old children's books. I found in Babar, has anyone read Babar recently? Take a look at that book, and you won't believe the racialized images in there. You know, the white people are all prim and proper, and they've got anyone who's not white is portrayed as this savage jumping out of the jungle. And I started to think more about movies I'd watched in which, Indians were whooping and grunting and had no discernible language, no intelligence certainly, and were terrifying. So it became pretty, if you go looking into, for me when I went looking into my belief system and to look at what I had been exposed to as a child to support the belief that there's some natural order in which white people are at the top, it wasn't too hard to find. So then the third thing I started to think about was, and this is important because even when we are in predominantly or exclusively white spaces, this is the piece that we can start to change today. And that is the cultural norms that hold in place the current system that we have. So we talk about, you said politics and religion. So did anyone grow up being told not to discuss politics and religion in polite company? Right. You can't talk about racism without talking about politics and religion because that's what it is founded on. It's a political tool, and it was explained away with Christianity because we're going to save people, and white people are God's chosen people. So I started to think about, okay, so what is that? Don't talk about religions or politics. Well, that's about not creating conflict. Especially as a female in this society, I was absolutely taught not to rock the boat. If you don't have anything nice to say, right. So how can we possibly examine one another's belief systems, which are sure to be different? Even I talk to my child, our belief systems are a little different. She's growing up in a different era. If you grew up in a different part of the country, we're not even talking about race yet. If you're growing up with a different religion or a different ethnicity, Irish ancestors, Polish ancestors, Russian ancestors, Greek ancestors, English ancestors, or just the family dynamics. We all are coming from a different place. And so if we can't talk openly about it where there's sure to be some difference of opinion, and different belief systems, then we're all just kind of stuck in these superficial relationships. And what I learned is that spending a lifetime avoiding conflict left me with exactly 0 skills to navigate it, if it did come up. So my brother's always saying, Debbie, you have to tell people what's good about getting into this work. You can't just make it sound so bad. So here's the good. There's so many great reasons, but here's what's amazing is that as I have learned to engage openly and courageously in conversations about race and religious difference and learning about sexual orientation, transgender issues, class difference. Ooh, class difference is as hard for me as anything. As I learn to engage in all of these and be a good listener and know what kind of questions to ask and make myself vulnerable and open in saying, I didn't know any of this. Yeah, really, I didn't, I swear. Yeah, I was that ignorant. To have those kind of open, honest exchanges has made me a better parent, a better spouse, a better friend, a better community member. And so when I say, the work that can be done in white spaces is, I have a whole workshop that's nothing but looking at the dominant white culture and how it holds organizations in place, and not just around race, but it makes any kind of change hard. It can make us tradition bound. It can make us want to go back to the good old days. When in fact, when we learn to engage in ways that are, where maybe it's okay to get a little angry, a woman can get upset and not be seen as weak, a man can get upset and not be seen as weak, that there are all kinds of social norms that we have that really what they do is they hold in place the current structure, and I would go along with it because I didn't want to look bad. So I'm putting my own status ahead of a collective well-being. So in that spirit, people should have had index cards handed out. We're going to go into Q&A. And the reason I hand out index cards is because not everyone is comfortable holding their hand up, and not everyone is comfortable writing, so I offer you 2 choices. And I hope what I have found is that every question that gets asked, you see other people going like this. Because often, when whoever asks the most courageous question, it's on everybody's mind and no one dares ask it, so be the brave one, or one of the brave ones.
So how do you initiate a conversation?
So how do I initiate a conversation? Well, so that's a broad question. Like if I'm sitting on an airplane, that's really different than being in a board meeting. So.
But where you feel that you want to have a conversation with somebody.
Okay, so let's take some concrete examples. Like let's say someone makes a racist joke, right? I'm at a cocktail party and someone makes a racist or a religious slur or any kind of a slur against another human being in a way that I feel is holding the system in place, personally offensive, whatever that list is. What I have learned to do, and if you notice in my book, all I do is talk about myself. I don't talk about that's unjust, that's this, that's that. I say, oh, that just makes me feel sick to hear you say that. And then I start exploring their belief system. I start saying, so what does that mean? Like, tell me more about what you feel about Jewish people. So let's say it was a jab at Jews. What are your beliefs about? Do you have any Jewish friends or family? So I've learned to do a lot of questioning, and not in an aggressive way, because honestly, I really want to know. Where did you get those ideas? And what I've learned is that often when people start hearing themselves talk, they're like, oh, I can't believe I just said that. And in our society, they're not often asked to explain themselves. So they just get to make the jab and run. So it's a way of holding people accountable while keeping them engaged, which I think is really important.
You talk to a lot of different school groups and university, and I'm just curious, I think many of us here acknowledge how it's difficult to talk about this. Is there an age or a generation that's finding it easier, do you think? Or are we all, in your experience?
So is there an age or a generation that finds it easier? I think a lot of, the quick answer would be, I hear a lot of people my age say that there's a huge difference for 15 to 20-year-olds. It's a different world, they've grown up together, and yet when I got called to a campus, I'm called to the campus by the Students of Color group, which always has some name, and they're traumatized because it's this colorblind, this idea that we're colorblind, we don't see color anymore, we're over all that, when in fact cultural norms and power differentials play out. And so I don't think it's easier. The group I would say it's easiest for are little kids who are just totally open to talking about it in a very normal way, which is so you start with preschool in this school, right? I think it's really exciting. There are not a ton, but there are, I would say, there are 5 schools I know of across the country that are doing really intensive work on this issue with younger kids. Now, that does not mean we're talking about race, the power of illusion, and the day I lost my head over the GI Bill. It means doing things like this. And one of them was the first grade class that I was in, where we did the first day of school. When you get little kids to school, they often do a portrait on one of the first days. So, and this was another teacher's idea. Instead of just having, them do the outline of their body, we asked them to come up with a skin color recipe, and we had like 20 paints out, and they got to mix until they came as close as they felt was accurate to their own skin color. And so, for instance, I might be 1 part coffee, 3 parts peach, 1 part vanilla. And we had names for all of these paints. And over the course of the year, kids would say, she's wearing the orange parka, she's 50 cinnamon, 50 coffee. And so they're very open to normalizing this. And yet it's also important at some point with kids is to start introducing some of this history, because it's when we ignore our history that the myth gets built on. And I was at a conference somewhere, and there's a group in New York City called Border Crossers. If you ever want to do a workshop with students and teachers of young students, they're amazing. And someone from that group said, I can't believe it when people say it's too scary to talk about. We talk about fire. We tell them to stop, drop, and roll and act like there's smoke in the room and the building's on fire and pretend you're crawling out. We tell them, what to do if a stranger abducts you. And yet we think racism is too scary to talk about. Or it's too hard. Well, does that mean we don't start talking about addition and subtraction? Well, math is hard. So there really are ways to start talking to young children about this. And what I love about the Community Connections group here is that what I found as a teacher is if you do this in a classroom, and I even found this as a parent, because my children started waking up way before I did. They would come home and say something to me, and I would go, what are you talking about? Now, if I were a different kind of a parent, I might have picked up the phone and called the school and said, what are you teaching my child? So it's really important for parents to have a forum to be able to discuss this, because it is the grown-ups who pass these myths and these cultural norms down. Shh, don't talk about that. So.
Can you talk about impact versus intent and your experience with that nuance?
Yeah, okay, this is another thing that we can practice in our everyday relationships. Race not need be involved, but the stakes get very high around race. So the question is, can I explain impact versus intent? So, for instance, when you in the gray shirt back there, when you talked about what you said, I want my coffee black, and I'm not going to repeat the rest of it. Your intent is to be lighthearted and engaging and fun, and yet the impact of somebody standing near you or the person you were talking to might be severe. And when it comes to race, it's really hard. It's been a real stretch for me as a white person to just to understand how deep and multi-generational the wounds around racism are, and what a microaggression, which is a term of, with a white person having a negative impact on someone with a casual comment. That microaggression and the accumulation of microaggressions, those really, really hurt. And so when I would have people say things to me, and I don't even have a good example, but if someone said something to me sort of suggesting what I had said was offensive, my go-to response was always, I didn't mean it that way. And I would get really pissed off. Like, do good intentions count for anything? It took me a long time to learn to do was, and this is thinking about group function or relationship function as opposed to my own status, was to say, wow, I am so sorry. I didn't mean it that way. Is there anything else you need to say to me? Or for me to go, if they said, don't you know about, X, Y, Z, don't you know about mass incarceration? Do you have any idea what's going on in our urban communities right now? It isn't always the best approach to say, no, can you tell me more if this is someone that I've just triggered? But the really responsible thing that a white person can do is go off and learn about this from other white people, go on the internet, get a book. So I've sort of gotten off track at the impact versus intent. But is there anything more you want me to say about that?
Well, good explanation.
No.
I just had to respond when someone calls you on it.
Yeah, but you know what? When my husband said, this morning when I said goodbye and you barely looked up, like that really hurt my feelings. Oh my God, are you kidding? That hurt your feelings? Like, okay, that's intent and impact. I didn't intend it to hurt him, but it hurt him. And he has the courage to tell me it hurt him. Like, I need to stop and say, oh my God, I'm so sorry. I'm so sorry. Is there anything else you need to tell me? Or I was just so busy. No, now I'm going into my intention. So intention and impact, it's saving face was like a full-time job for me in any arena. And so it's in learning to accept feedback in a non-defensive way is a really good way to just start softening communities. And I don't have it out, but the list was shared with me. What is it? Be kind, be open.
Our community code.
The community code. And I thought, whoa, you've got accountability in there. That's great. There's so much in that code that is, whether or not it was intended to or not, is a counterweight to what are often the social norms in our dominant culture, which can be pretty rigid and scary and competitive, and I have to look good and look smart. So I was really impressed with those norms.
I have two questions, if you can stomach the first one and then get to the second one. On Labor Day, I was up visiting my sister, who you would know as Linda Leach.
Oh, Harold.
Yeah.
Hi, Harold.
And so your sister Emily was a classmate of mine. And I remember we had 5 black families in Winchester, just to correct the record, in those days. And your sister certainly would have known the West. We watched Hogan's Heroes, and they did have Kinch, who was a black soldier. And there was the whole civil rights thing that happened in the 1960s, but I'm 6 years older than you. So I'm reading your book, which Linda, she was all excited she gave me the book. And I'm thinking, wow, how could you not know about this stuff at the time? Is it just what about your sister, your older sister?
Okay, so this is really important. Someone always asks me this, and here's the answer. So when it came time to publish my book, and we had to pick a cover, I really wanted this picture that was the 5 kids, like it was a little Christmas card thing. And my brothers and sisters were like, I was like, I had just spent 4 years working on this book. Where's the support, you guys? I was really, really legitimately like pissed off. And finally, Emily said to me, Debbie, we weren't all as clueless as you. And she said, we totally support you, but it's really your story. So here's the deal. So I'm the youngest of 5, and the oldest is 14 years older and the second oldest is 12 years older. And those two sisters actually spent the Freedom Summer down south living with families and doing the voter registration. So how could, and I did not know that until after this whole blow up about we're not as clueless as you.
Or 2 or 3 at the time.
Well, here's what we think. Now, my parents aren't alive for us to fact check this, but, and by the way, talking about this issue and what you learned in your house and didn't is a fantastic way to start the conversation with your own siblings. And I have all kinds of questions in my book, siblings and cousins. Okay, so here I am, this super chatty 4-year-old, and my 2 oldest siblings are spending the summer, the Freedom Summer. My father's brother lives in South Carolina and is not an open-minded person, and probably what we would call an outspoken bigot. And our theory that we have come up with amongst the 5 siblings is that they all made a pact not to talk to me about it, lest I spill the beans at Thanksgiving dinner. The other thing was that my parents they made an agreement, which they talked openly about with regret years later. They made an agreement to give their children an idyllic, protected childhood. And so we were not allowed to watch TV, which is why I went to Linda Leach's house every day at lunch when you could walk home from school, because you could watch Bewitched at Linda Leach's kitchen table while your mother made us tuna sandwiches. But the only TV we got to watch was TV together as a family, 7 of us sitting on a couch. We got to watch Walt Disney on Sunday night, and that was it. And The Wizard of Oz when it came around once a year. And I am not exaggerating. That was the TV, unless I escaped to a friend's house, which I did a lot of. But yeah, so I was super ignorant, and I tell this story in my book that my parents were away the day that Martin Luther King was killed, and we had a babysitter staying with us, like away overnight, for a couple of weeks. We had a babysitter staying with us, and she was in the room where the TV was, just bawling and sobbing and screaming. And I came down, and she just choked out the words that Martin Luther King had been killed. And I was irritated because I didn't know America had a king. I thought we had a president. So that is how ignorant I was. And so if this were a book about weight loss, we're talking about the person who lost 600 pounds.
And my second question.
Yep, and let me just do a time check because I want to make sure. Okay, so we've got about 5 more minutes. That feel right to everybody?
I think a lot of sociological studies have shown that human nature naturally divides into in-groups, our group and all the others. And is that a pessimistic fact that will make difficult our ever being able to just see people openly, without prejudice, etc.?
So how much is a nature-nurture question? How much of nature predisposes us to self-sort in ways that will forever leave us behaving in tribalistic ways, I guess is what I hear you saying?
Yeah, I mean, they do studies with kids who can hardly even talk, and they've noticed preferences for in-group versus out-group.
Right, so in-group versus out-group. So I do certainly bias, it's necessary. If I were going through the jungle hundreds of years ago, thousands of years ago, I would need to recognize animal that's going to eat me, animal that's not. And so it is a part of our wiring to know danger, and it's also a part of our wiring to seek comfort. And yet what we see as dangerous and what we see as comfortable, I believe, is highly socialized. So, if you talk to somebody who's moved to America from another country, for instance, and they have not had the experience of racial segregation and being taught to fear other, they are startled by what they see here. I don't know if we have anybody in a room who falls into that description, someone who's come to this country and sort of gone, whoa, wow, this is like in-your-face racism. The other thing, this is probably an important point to insert, one I think is one of the most powerful pieces of our history is, the word white was invented on these shores. You're not white until you come to America. You're not black until you come to America. You're not a Latino until you come to America. You're not, name that census racial category until you come to America. These are American labels and terms to which all kinds of rights and access are attached. So Bacon's Rebellion happened in the late 1600s in Virginia, and it was the elite who were Anglo white men had come to these shores, and they were starting to accumulate great wealth on the backs of free laborers. And the laborers at that point were actually racially mixed, because there were many white people who came to America as on a indentured servant status, and when their 4 or 7 years were up, they were free. And both the free and the servant class started to rise up, and the biggest moment was this Bacon's Rebellion, saying, hey, landowners, you're not sharing any of this. We have no rights. You've got to change this. It was a bloody rebellion. And out of that came some laws. And the first attempt at a law was that, well, you've got to be Christian to have any kind of voting rights or own land here, said the ones who were making the rules. And the word Christian didn't hold, because you could change religions. So the Native Americans, who they were very much wanting to exclude from those rights, said, well, I'll convert. I'll come to church. So that didn't work. And then they were searching for a term. At one point, the term sufficiently British-like was floated, and that didn't work. And white was finally the term. And so from that point on, in the U.S. court system, you can see case after case after case of individual or an entire population fighting for the right to be white. So the Irish at first were not white. Armenians at one point were not white. Italians were not white. You had to become white, and there were groups excluded, group after group. And then, so you can imagine if being white has so much value. Does anyone have families who came over from a country where there was a different language, and you have stories in your family history of, my grandmother didn't want us to speak the language, we had to learn English right away, she wanted us to act American, be American, because this American meant white, and the stakes were incredibly high. So, and there's so much to talk about. There's so much to learn on this, and there are amazing resources out there, many of which are listed on my website. So, did we get anyone writing a question?
Not that I was aware of.
No? Now, you can't lift it up and say me, because we'll know what your question is. Well, you could, but...
So I feel that I'm writing mine because I didn't know how to write it.
Oh.
So I'm only halfway through the book, but how far I am is about unpacking one's own racism. But you've also, by that point, certainly talked about the cumulative effect of generations of whiteness. So do you have thoughts on what one's responsibility is to divesting oneself of that? Or, I mean, there is what you do one-on-one, but in an affirmative action sort of way.
Okay, so we're talking about this notion that...
Systemic racism, how does one reverse?
Right there. Right, okay, and so in my particular case, I'm someone who benefited hugely from generation after generation of systemic racism, and what now? How do we divest? So the term reparations is a term which would mean actually putting money back in the pockets of particularly enslaved Africans who worked for free for years and built the economy here. Many of our buildings and just the money in our bank accounts is built on the back of free labor, and so there's the idea of reparations. And I've thought about that so much, is how, like, just what would be the, I have an MBA, I love math, I love spreadsheets, I can't begin to think of how you would do that. But for instance, I think the most important thing that we could do would be to uncouple school budgets from property tax. I don't know why every American in the United States of America can't get the same quality education And yet to do that, I know what the old me would have thought, oh, why am I giving up my money for them? They didn't work as hard. So I don't know how you could ever get a law like that passed without educating the vast majority of Americans, anyone who would listen, on the fact that the reason our ship is so imbalanced is because of the way whites have been favored through government policy and government handouts. And so to say we shouldn't give them a handout, when I hear someone say that, it's my first clue that their belief system is still in that distorted, the myth-making belief system. And let me just say, while we're talking about wealth, this was the article that I was going to read in the parking lot when I got there early to dinner. In fact, I got there half an hour late, so I never got to read it. But there's something on the side that says, tracing the same households over 25 years, the total wealth gap between white and African American families nearly triples. So you know how a lot of times people are saying it's getting better? Okay, so in the last 25 years, the wealth gap has tripled, increasing from an $85,000 gap in 1984 to a $236,500 gap now. The biggest drivers of the growing wealth gap are years of home ownership. This is completely tied to lending and housing policy. Household income. Well, how do you get an income? You get a job because you got a good education and you have social capital, right? So you can see the advantage there. Another driver is unemployment. So this is driving you down, which is much more prominent among African American families. It's not because they don't work harder, as I once thought, or weren't as intelligent as I once thought, but it's because if you can't get an education and you don't know the social norms of, and you don't have any connections to, and that transportation piece, often our black and brown, marginalized black and brown communities are situated in a way that it takes 2 or 3 bus or train trips, public transportation trips, to get to a downtown commerce area, and that's very intentional because we don't want those people to come here. So think of what that does in terms of job opportunity. Another driver is a college education. This is what affirmative action has tried to write, but how do you get somebody, frankly, if somebody is competing for the same college my daughter is competing, and they have the same SAT score and the same basic grades, I can guarantee you that child has worked a lot harder than mine, and that family has worked a lot harder than mine. And yet when a person of color enters a predominantly white space and everyone is saying, great, you're taking white people's spots, and what, you get here on a football scholarship and are made to feel like second-class citizens, we will live up or down to the expectations imposed on us. And the final one is inheritance. So by the way, that $17,000 that my parents bought, that house they bought, was sold 40 years later for $1 million. That, together with the wealth my father amassed as a lawyer, and the wealth that my parents both inherited from their own parents, which had a lot to do with housing, lending, job opportunity, land grants, another big piece of my family history. What else is in there? Someone just say something? Education, for sure. That inheritance came down to me and my 4 siblings. We did nothing for that, but get born into the right family. So that is what and again, we're talking in that case about material impacts, but think about the psychological impacts. So for me to think that I didn't have a race, oh my God, white invented race. And we all have a huge responsibility. You think about, as a woman, if I were to walk into a boardroom that was predominantly male and feel like I was being made a second-class citizen, or people were laughing at me, or, I would shrink. I would hope that a man would be able to say, you know what, I noticed that Debbie's got some good ideas, and I think we should all, respect her a little more. Maybe he could say this in a moment where the men were together. I would like that kind of allyship. I would like to be able to know there was a man I could talk to. And that's the role that I feel that white people have to play. It's not to step in and lead the charge. It's to step back and make room and talk to other white people and say, I'm learning about what a myth it is that white people are superior. And even if you haven't thought white people are superior, you've heard that people are disadvantaged. But you can't be disadvantaged without someone being advantaged, which is sort of an invisible piece. You can't have a short end of a stick without a long end of a stick. So I really encourage everybody, I hope that you enjoyed tonight, and I hope that you'll do something with it. I hope that you will, and this is not just about my book sales, there's so many great books out there, but actually, talk to family and friends about this, and you don't, know, without shame or blame. Nobody in this room invented this, but we all inherited it. And every day that goes by where there isn't racial justice progress made, there are kids whose spirits are being crushed. And there are kids like mine who are growing up entitled, thinking that they're actually super smart. And they are smart, and they do work hard, but there are a lot of kids who are smart and work hard, and we shouldn't color code it. So, thank you for being here.